First, how are bond yields calculated? Let's think in terms of a pot of gold at the end of a rainbow. Imagine that your Aunt Mary gives you $80 for your 15th birthday. You want to save this money to buy a bike in 3 years' time. Your sister just turned driving age and would like to buy a used car. She is asking her family for loans. If you lend your sister the $80, she promises to give you $90 back spread over time. $10 back next year, $10 back the year after, then $70 back in 3 years' time when she plans to get a job. Your mother would rather you deposit your $80 gift in Ledyard Bank to earn interest. Ledyard Bank is offering 4.53% per year interest. Which option makes you richer in 3 years? Which option leads to the bigger pot of gold at the end of the rainbow? How big would the pot be if you deposited the $80 in Ledyard at a 4.53% interest rate for 3 years? Let's visualize the money changing hands if you were to deposit the money at Ledyard. To begin with, you hand over $80 to the bank. Let's depict that as negative $80. At the end of year 1, you would get $3.60 in interest, 4.53% of the $80 balance. That would make your balance $83.60. At the end of year 2, you would get 4.53% interest on the $83.60 balance, meaning $3.80 interest in year 2. The balance would now be $87.40. At the end of year 3, you would get 4.53% on the $87.40 balance, meaning $4 of interest in year 3. You then withdraw your deposit and the accumulated interest of $3.60, $3.80, and $4. So if you had put the money in Ledyard, you would end up with $91.40. How big would the pot be if you lent to your sister? You hand your sister $80. In the end of year 1, your sister hands you $10. At the end of year 2, she hands you another $10. At the end of year 3, she settles the loan and hands you $70. Assume you deposit both $10 bills in Ledyard Bank. Let's treat each in turn as a separate deposit to grow at Ledyard. Let's take the first $10 payment. At the end of year 2, this would grow to a rounded $10.50 in the bank. And at the end of year 3, it would grow to approximately $10.90. Let's take the second $10 payment. At the end of year 3, this repayment would become a rounded $10.50. Recall that your sister also hands you $70 at the end of year 3. You've got no time for this to accumulate interest in Ledyard Bank. So how much did you end up with by lending $80 to your sister? $10.90 plus $10.50 plus $70 for a total pot of gold of $91.40. So provided you think your sister will repay you in full, and provided Ledyard will still be around when it comes time to withdraw the money, this pot of gold will be the same size as that pot of gold. You forked out the same $80 and in roundabout ways ultimately got to $91.40 in both scenarios. You are therefore entirely indifferent between lending to your sister on the agreed terms and depositing $80 in Ledyard for 4.53% interest. In fixed income terminology, the yield on the loan to your sister is 4.53%. That's all a bond yield is, the equivalent interest rate on a bank account that would provide an identical pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. But how did we know that 4.53% would make you indifferent between lending to your sister and depositing it in the bank? One way is guesswork. Let's demonstrate. You've grown up and left home. You win the lottery and take home $1 million after taxes. Your brother now comes to you asking for a loan to buy a boat. He is looking for $1 million and agrees to pay you back $100,000 next year, $100,000 the year after, then $1,100,000 in 3 years' time when he will come into an inheritance. It's the weekend, and Ledyard Bank is closed, so you don't know the interest rate to help you decide whether or not to lend your brother the money. But he doesn't know the first thing about fixed income, so he's pressing you for an answer. Which option should you go for? Let's just see what deposit rate would make your pots of gold at the end of the 3 years the same size, regardless of whether you deposited or lent the $1 million. If on Monday morning you discover that the bank is offering above this rate, you should bank it. Below, and you should lend to your brother. Let's suppose the bank were paying 5%. Using the same methodology from the previous example where you deposited $80 at 4.53% interest, you're now going to deposit $1 million at 5% interest. You would end up with $1,157,625. What if you lent to your brother with this bank deposit rate of 5% for the interim repayments? Let's deposit the interim payments in Ledyard Bank at 5% interest, treating each in turn as a separate deposit. You would end up with $1,315,250. You should therefore clearly lend the money to your brother, if Ledyard offers only a 5% interest rate, as you will end up with a bigger pot of gold than the bank would give you. We therefore have not correctly guessed the yield on the loan to your brother. Let's try a higher guess. What if the bank paid 15% interest? In this case, you would end up with $1,520,875. What if you lent to your brother with this elevated bank deposit rate of 15% for the interim repayments? As before, let's deposit the interim payments at Ledyard Bank, but this time at 15% interest. You would end up with $1,347,250. You should therefore clearly deposit the money at Ledyard if the bank offers a 15% rate, as you will end up with a bigger pot of gold than if you lend to your brother. We now appear to have overshot in our guess of the yield on the loan to your brother. Our 5% guess was too low, and our 15% guess was too high. Let's make our next guess 10%. If the bank paid 10% interest and you deposited the money, you would end up with $1,331,000. What if you lent to your brother with this 10% bank deposit rate for the interim repayments? As before, let's deposit the interim payments in Ledyard Bank, but this time at 10% interest. You would end up with $1,331,000. Success! You would get the same size pot of gold from depositing it at Ledyard's at 10% as you would from lending to your brother. So now you know the precise deposit rate at Ledyard's above which you would park your money at the bank and below which you would instead choose to lend to your brother. So, what's the takeaway? Well, if you have the loan terms and enough time on your hands, you can guess your way to a bond yield. You'll be pleased to hear that there's a shortcut to extracting the yield on a bond from the bond terms, either using the internal rate of return function on a spreadsheet or simply looking at the Bloomberg yield and spread function, YAS, and reading off the pre-calculated yield. Let's demonstrate the YAS shortcut using the Rwanda example. Rwanda borrowed $400 million in May 2013 and agreed to pay back $27 million per year. Given that the 10-year bond was issued halfway through 2013, there were smaller $13.5 million interest payments in both the first and final year. The $400 million principal amount is due to be paid back in 2023. When the bond was sold to the public in May 2013, it had a yield of 7%. Let's visualize why an investor would be indifferent between putting $400 million into a bank paying 7% per year until 2023 and lending to Rwanda on these terms. Let's use the same methodology from the previous example where you deposited $1 million instead of lending it to your brother. Imagine that you deposit $400 million in the bank at a 7% interest rate instead of lending it to Rwanda. You would end up with $786 million in 2023. This consists of the $400 million that you deposited and the compounded interest. Now let's see how much you'd end up with if you lent the $400 million to Rwanda and deposited the coupon repayments at 7% per year using the method outlined previously. You would earn $386 million in compound interest from banking the separate coupon repayments, and you would also get back the original principal. In total, you would end up with $786 million in 2023. Therefore, you would be indifferent between lending to Rwanda while reinvesting at 7% and a bank account paying a 7% annual interest. At the end of the day, both would give you $786 million in 2023. This means the yield on the bond is 7%. This equivalent bank deposit rate or bond yield has been pre-calculated for you for any bond on the Bloomberg yield and spread function, YAS. As you can now appreciate, this saves you a lot of time and effort. If we type Rwanda into the command line, select the Rwandan government, select the relevant bond, and then pull up the YAS function, we can see that the yield on the bond at the time it was issued was 7%. Bloomberg did the hard work for you. So now you know what a bond yield is and where to find it. It's just the interest rate on an equivalent bank account for the duration of the bond. Think of bond yields, therefore, as nothing more than advertised deposit rates in the window of the bank. The difference is that the rates on offer to new buyers of the bond will move as the price of the bond moves. You can peer into the window of the bank for all the major economies of the world on the WB function, WB standing not for Window of Bank, but World Bond Markets. The column in blue is nothing more than the advertised deposit rates for the governments of the world were you to buy their bonds. Now let's see what makes bond yields move. There are two key drivers, credit risk and macroeconomics. Before you lend someone money, you consider how likely you are to get your money back. Despite being called fixed income and having a rigid repayment schedule, bonds are reliant on the borrower's ability and willingness to repay. The income is hardly fixed if you don't get repaid. Sometimes even governments default on their bonds, as we will see. Let's demonstrate the relationship between creditworthiness and yield. We begin by visualizing the cash flows on an imaginary bond. We depict the price paid for the bond as a negative number at the outset. The bars on the right depict the chronological repayments. This bond pays back $10 per year and, in the final year, pays back $50 principal in addition to the final $10 coupon. In sum, therefore, the $100 upfront payment for the bond will deliver $150 over the next 10 years. The methodology we walked through earlier would reveal that the yield on this bond would be 6.3%. Now, imagine that you believe the borrower will go bust at the end of year 8. This means that you, the lender, will get only $80 back instead of the $150 for the full period. This belief naturally makes you pay less for this bond today. Bond prices today reflect beliefs on repayment likelihood tomorrow. The assumption when calculating yield, however, is that the income is truly fixed, that the full repayment amounts promised will materialize. Therefore, notwithstanding your fears about the solvency of the borrower, when it comes to calculating the yield, you assume that you will get the same cash for a lower price. In this example, if the solvency fears reduce the bond price from $100 to $50, the resulting yield will be 20%. The same amount of cash tomorrow for less upfront today means more bang for your buck. Now imagine if you believe that the borrower will go bust at the end of year 4. You are now willing to pay even less, as you will only get $40 back, assuming the company remains solvent for the next 4 years. Suppose you are willing to pay only $20 due to the extreme risk. The calculated yield will now be far higher at 51.2%. Why? Because you are paying far less for the promised $150. It's just very unlikely that the $150 will materialize. When bond investors, which in the world of bonds is a fancy word for lenders, begin to doubt the creditworthiness of a borrower, yields move sharply upwards. Let's see this correlation between poor creditworthiness and high yield play out in the real world for government bonds. There are many examples of government defaults. One of the biggest recent examples is Argentina, which defaulted on $132 billion in 2001. There are many more examples, such as Cuba in 1986, Ecuador in 2008, and Ivory Coast in 2011. Let's go back to the World Bond Markets, or WB function, to pull up the yields of some major government bonds. The yields partly reflect the market's view of whether the debts are likely to be repaid. If the market believes that a government may have trouble paying the money back, the price of the bond will be lower, and therefore the yield higher. This makes future borrowing more expensive for this government. In this way, the bond market instills fiscal discipline in governments. While democracies typically face their electorate every few years, governments with outstanding bonds face the bond market every trading day. Bond yields can be considered a running verdict on their handling of the economy and thus their creditworthiness. Elevated bond yields may force a government into budget cuts or tax hikes, both unpopular with voters. For this reason, creditors can be immensely unpopular with governments and are often called bond vigilantes. They can cost politicians their jobs. It is for this reason that President Bill Clinton's fiscal advisor, James Carville, said in 1993, "I used to think that if there was reincarnation, I wanted to come back as the president or the pope or as a 400 baseball hitter. But now I would like to come back as the bond market. You can intimidate everybody." To keep tabs on a government's creditworthiness, investors commonly look at three metrics. All three have the power to make investors demand higher yields in government bond auctions. Often, a government debt crisis will involve more than one of these factors. Government debt as a proportion of GDP, government budget deficit as a proportion of GDP, and the aggressiveness of the repayment schedule. Let's start with debt to GDP. When a government borrows to build a bridge, dam, or hospital, the project payments contribute to GDP, as we saw in the Economic Indicators module. When a government ultimately pays off the resulting debt, however, these repayments are not counted as part of GDP. They're merely paying back money borrowed to buy goods and services in the past, meaning that the GDP growth from those goods and services has already happened. Therefore, when a government borrows and spends, it drives GDP growth. But when the debt comes due, debt repayments inhibit GDP growth. And the greater the debt as a proportion of GDP, the greater the debt repayments, and therefore the greater the drag on the economy. Let's take a look at the World Countries Debt Monitor, or WCDM function. On the far right, we can see the value of government debt as a proportion of GDP for several countries. There is no preordained percentage of debt to GDP above which the bond market will panic. Let's look at an example of when the bond market did panic about the debt load of a specific government. Greece in 2010. If we chart the Greek debt to GDP ratio and overlay the yield of Greek 10-year bonds, we can see that debt to GDP spiked up to over 160% in 2011, and Greek bond yields peaked at 35% that year. Greece struggled to find buyers in its government bond auctions. There are many examples of when governments have successfully dealt with high debt burdens. A classic example is how the United States debt soared to 110% of its GDP by the end of the Second World War and was subsequently paid down during the boom of the 1960s. Debt to GDP ultimately bottomed out at 30% in the mid-1970s. Greece in 2017 still had a high debt-to-GDP ratio of 182%. But Japan, the world's third largest economy, had the highest debt-to-GDP of any country at 235%. If we now look at the world bond market, we see that Greece in 2017 still had a relatively high 10-year bond yield of about 7%, while Japan's were at approximately 0%. A second major indicator of creditworthiness is the extent to which the government is living beyond its means as measured by the budget deficit as a proportion of GDP. Let's go back to the debt monitor WCDM and change the far right column from debt to GDP to deficit to GDP. Investors do not just look at the absolute debt burden in relation to GDP. They also look at the size of the budget funding gap that needs to be plugged by the bond market. Deficit to GDP takes the annual government budget deficit, divides it by GDP, and expresses it as a percentage. As a surplus is positive and a deficit is negative, governments with deficits have negative deficit to GDP ratios. In plain English, this means that the governments are spending more money than they are bringing in through taxation, relying on the bond market to finance their deficit. The higher the deficit as a percentage of GDP, the higher the rate at which the government is racking up new debt. Over time, this means that the interest payments go up as a proportion of the government budget. Investors typically will demand a higher yield to compensate for the elevated risk. Ultimately, the bond market can refuse to finance a budget deficit, although again, there is no hard and fast rule on the percentage deficit to GDP that will make investors balk. That said, when the Greek deficit reached 16% of GDP in 2009, the market caught on and pushed the yields up to 30% by 2011. The third aspect commonly looked at when considering government creditworthiness is the aggressiveness of the repayment schedule of the debt. This is a fancy way of asking whether the lender thinks that, timing-wise, the borrower will have the cash available when the repayments come due. Governments can borrow short-term or long-term. Generally, borrowing over the short term attracts a lower annual interest rate because it lowers risk for the lender. This is tempting to governments as it lowers their interest payments. There is a snag, however. Imagine a student who decides to use credit cards as a source of cash. He applies for and gets a credit card that promises no interest payments for a year. When the year is up, he applies for another credit card that promises no interest on transferred debt. This will only work for as long as he can find willing credit card companies to pay off the last card at 0%. If he continues doing this, however, the credit card companies may start to question his ability to repay and demand high interest rates. What is true for consumers is true for governments. The downside of governments taking advantage of low-interest short-term debt is that lenders can pull the rug and suddenly demand very high yields, as we saw with Greece. Let's see this concept in the context of government bonds. The DDIS function shows us the repayment schedule for the debt of any government. In the past, the United Kingdom traditionally chose the safe path of long-term borrowing. Due to the higher risk to the lender, this path typically is open only to the most credit-worthy countries. Let's now look at an example of a government traditionally reliant largely on short-term borrowing, the United States. At the time shown, it was the opposite of the UK. By borrowing in the short term and refinancing the debt on a regular basis, the U.S. government takes advantage of the lower interest rates available for short-term borrowers. Isn't the U.S. fearful that investors may pull the rug from under it? No. Remember the underpinnings of the United States' creditworthiness. The U.S. can print the world's reserve currency and tax a very wealthy economy. This is the difference between the U.S. and a consumer who has maxed out his credit card. For less creditworthy countries, borrowing in the short term is risky, as it requires large near-term repayments. Such governments have gotten into trouble time and again in the government bond markets. In the Asian crisis in the late 1990s, Thailand, South Korea, and Indonesia all fell into this trap. So did Iceland in 2008. Let's illustrate how Greece fell into this trap using the DDIS chart for Greece and showing the repayment schedule from both before the crisis emerged and after the first major International Monetary Fund bailout of Greece. The columns on this chart show the debt repayment schedule for Greece after the first bailout was granted. Notice how the bulk of the debt was repayable far in the future. If we now plot how the repayment profile looked before the crisis became apparent, shortly before the 2010 debt crisis and spike in bond yields, the picture was very different. At that time, Greece was heavily reliant on short-term debt. As we saw from the yield chart a little earlier, the market pulled the rug in 2010. It was the IMF's initial bailout which repaid the short-term debt, the yellow bars, and converted it to long-term debt, the big blue bar on the right. We just reviewed 3 credit risk factors which can trigger a debt crisis. There are 2 credit risk indicators investors commonly use to see trouble brewing: credit ratings and credit default swaps. Let's start with credit ratings. There are several credit rating agencies that rate bonds. Each has a rating system. Take Standard & Poor's. The highest level of creditworthiness is AAA, while the lowest is D, which stands for default. According to an S&P analysis, 7.5% of BBB-rated bonds defaulted within 10 years, while 94% of CCC or lower-rated bonds defaulted within 10 years. It is therefore helpful that more than 120 countries have their government debt rated by a ratings agency. Here is a ratings table of the developed markets. We can sort the S&P ratings by clicking the column header. Unsurprisingly, most developed markets have high ratings, except for Greece, with the lowest rating of the group. Given the predictive quality of government bond ratings, investors pay close attention when they change. Provides a list of the most recent government bond credit rating changes. A green rating represents a recent upgrade to that rating, while a red rating represents a recent downgrade. Rating agencies also rate corporate bonds. The lower-risk, higher-rated corporate bonds with at least a BBB- rating or above are called investment grade. The higher-risk, lower-rated corporate bonds, BB+ and below, are called non-investment grade, speculative, high yield, or simply junk. The track record for credit rating agencies is decidedly patchier for corporate bonds than it is for government bonds. American energy company Enron went bust in 2001, at which point it was the largest corporate bankruptcy in the USA. The year before, Enron was lionized by Fortune magazine. Let's pull up the credit rating profile for Enron with the CRPR function. It had a BBB+ investment grade rating in the 6 years from 1995 to the 31st of October 2001. By December 3, 2001, 33 days later, it had been downgraded by S&P to D for default. Enron had gone bust. Since the Enron debacle, a new instrument called a credit default swap became increasingly popular as an alternative to monitoring credit ratings. CDSs are a form of insurance against governments and corporations going bust. CDSs often provide a more timely warning of impending default than credit ratings. This is because they are real-time readings based on traded instruments. The higher the CDS spread, the higher the risk. For example, during the 2008 financial crisis, a few months after the failure of investment bank Bear Stearns, the CDS spreads of both Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley notoriously spiked as investors questioned whether they would survive. Since the early 2000s, credit default swaps have also been available on government bonds. Let's look at government CDSs by typing Sovereign CDS and selecting the Sovereign CDS Monitor, SOVR. Here we can see that on this separate measure in 2017, as with credit ratings, Greece again had the lowest credit worthiness, represented by the highest CDS spread. CDS spreads can be used to calculate the implied probability of a government or corporation defaulting. Here, the white line shows the calculated chance that Greece will default in the subsequent 5 years after any given point on the chart. Shortly before the first bailout in 2010, this calculation indicated a 100% chance of default. If we overlay the spike in Greece's 10-year bond yields, we can see that the CDS spreads foretold trouble several months before the spike in Greek government bond yields. This is why finance professionals sometimes obsess over exotic indicators. They can foretell the future. The other major driver of bond valuation is the macroeconomic environment. This drives yields via short-term interest rates and inflation. Let's begin with short-term interest rates. We will demonstrate the relationship between U.S. government bond yields and yields on other bonds by again visualizing a bond, this time an imaginary utopian 10-year government bond. Imagine that utopian government debt is perceived to be as safe as U.S. government debt, and that U.S. 10-year government bonds are currently yielding 4%. The bar chart depicts the chronological repayments on the utopian bond. As utopian government bonds have no credit risk, their yield should be the same as U.S. government bonds. The price, which sets the yield of the utopian bond at 4%, is $115. Now imagine that the Federal Reserve in the U.S. cuts short-term interest rates, and as a result, the yield on the 10-year U.S. government bond lowers from 4% to 3%. Both have the same risk profile, so both should, in theory, have the same yield. The price of this utopian bond would therefore quickly increase to equalize the yield with the U.S. government bond. Its price would rally from $115 to $122.50 in order to reduce its yield from 4% to 3%. Say the Federal Reserve in the U.S. now lifts short-term interest rates and the yield on the 10-year U.S. government bond increases from 3% to 5%. Of course, you would take the higher-yielding U.S. government bond. Therefore, investors would sell the utopian bond until the yield equalizes at 5%. This would reduce the price of the utopian government bond from $122.50 to $108. What's going on here? Think about when you buy a book online. You go to Amazon.com and find the book you want. You are then presented with the option either to buy a copy directly from Amazon for $17.95 or from another vendor for $16.75. If both books are in the same condition, you would opt for the cheaper one. However, you may be willing to pay the small premium to buy directly from Amazon if you are worried a small vendor may not deliver the book. If, on the other hand, Amazon were the cheapest, you would not think twice about ordering from them. The safety of ordering a book from Amazon compels other vendors to cut their prices. When other vendors are priced below Amazon, they typically only offer a small discount. In this case, you can pick up the same new book for $1.20 less if you go with the small vendor. This is because Amazon is such a major force in the book market that all vendors have to continually check whether their prices are competitive with Amazon's. If not, business would dry up for third-party vendors. Welcome to the world bond market. Amazon is the Fed. Books are bonds, other vendors are other bond issuers, and book prices are yields. As yields are simply the inverse of price, this yield competition phenomenon is simply price competition masked by the jargon of the bond market. The other major macroeconomic factor that affects bond valuation is inflation. With a few exceptions, inflation has a corrosive effect on the price of fixed-income instruments, including U.S. government bonds. Recall how Fed Chair Paul Volcker reduced inflation with a series of rate hikes? On the chart we showed in the currencies module, there was a general correlation between inflation and U.S. government bond yields over the last 60 years. When inflation was high, yields were high, as the inflation eroded the value of bonds. Let's demonstrate why this corrosion takes place by again visualizing an imaginary bond. Let's look at cash flows for a single 10-year bond. Even if the government repays the full amount of the promised fixed income, inflation, the silent enemy, will erode the purchasing power of those coupon and principal payments. Let's assume that you expect no inflation at all and that you are willing to pay $100 today for this stream of fixed income payments. This means that the effective annual interest rate, the yield, is 6.3%. Now, imagine inflation were 5% per year. This would corrode the purchasing power of the stream of coupons and the principal repayment of this bond, with later repayments corroded more due to the compounding effect of inflation over time. This would naturally make you pay less for this bond today. The $150 of repayments that you would get from this bond would only really feel like $106 in purchasing power, thanks to inflation. As yield is calculated by comparing the price you pay to the total amount of cash you get back, This lower purchasing price of $80 means you are apparently getting the same cash for a lower price, that is, a higher yield. In this case, an annual interest rate of 10.2%. Now imagine that inflation were even higher at 10% per year. This would make you even less willing to pay for the same $150 in repayments. In reality, this $150 would feel like $80 of purchasing power. If you were only willing today to pay, say, $60 for this stream of repayments, then the yield would be even higher at 15.9%. Why? Because you would be paying seemingly far less for an identical amount of cash on the right. It is for this reason that bond yields are called nominal and not real. You do not adjust the yield calculation for inflation. We have just shown that inflation is bad news to bondholders or lenders, such as savers and insurance companies. On the flip side, borrowers benefit from rising inflation. Imagine if you had a 30-year fixed payment mortgage requiring you to pay $1,000 per month for 30 years. Picture the impact of inflation. Your employer would be forced to give you significant pay increases to keep up with the cost of living, while your $1,000 per month mortgage payment would be unchanged. A borrower, therefore, would benefit as the inflation would inflate away the mortgage debt. The monthly payments would become less of a burden over time, given that the borrower's salary would likely rise in line with inflation. In a deflationary environment, on the other hand, the value of bonds is not eroded by inflation, and so lenders are happy. The debt burden for borrowers, such as homeowners, feels heavy, as it is not inflated away. No wonder that governments, almost all of whom are borrowers, do not tend to mind a dash of inflation. Think you've grasped these concepts? Answer these questions to check your understanding. To summarize, bond yields facilitate comparison between bonds by calculating what an equivalent bank deposit rate would be for the duration of the bond. The three biggest risks facing bondholders are the borrower not paying you back, having inflation eat into the repayments, and a rise in interest rates, pushing down the price of the bond. The seesaw relationship between prices and yields instills discipline in governments because investor worries about not getting paid back makes future borrowing more expensive for less creditworthy governments. Short-term borrowers tend to be charged lower interest rates, but the risk is that those rates can go up when they roll over the debt. Inflation is corrosive to bondholders as it diminishes the purchasing power of the repayments. It therefore sends bond prices down and bond yields up. U.S. government bonds are admired for their lack of credit risk. Therefore, all other bonds have to be priced competitively with U.S. government bonds.